So welcome everybody. Everybody can see Rachel, not my face, thankfully. So I'll be monitoring the waiting room as people come in. So I'd like to say a very big thank you for Rachel to spending our time with us today. Obviously today's webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with members, and you'll get the link after the when it's uploaded. So if you're able to keep your cameras and microphones switched off during the presentation, if you've got any questions, either ask them as they come along, popping your hand up. There is a button for reactions, I think, at the bottom, and or pop them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. But so today's gosh, everybody's still joining. So as I say, I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Russell. She's volunteered her time to talk to us again today about how we define necessary and appropriate when considering adaptations under a DFG. So Rachel is a senior advisor for foundations, previously the principal occupational therapist at Calderdale Council, and also a lecturer at Salford University, and she co-authored Adaptations Without Delay. And she's had a long history of working with the specialist section and served on our NEC in quite a few different roles over the years. So over to you, Rachel. Thank you very much.
Lovely, lovely. Can you still see my screen then, Dave?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Right, lovely. Okay. So yeah, David's already introduced me. Huge thank you to the specialist section for inviting me along this afternoon. The main focus is going to be around robust decision making. Is it necessary and appropriate? So it's going to kind of focus on our key role around in the DFG process. This presentation is kind of a combination of various bits and pieces I've been doing over the last few months around necessary and appropriate. So it may be that if people have seen me do other bits and pieces, some of this will feel familiar, but I don't think it ever harms kind of going through some of the bits and pieces. But hopefully, particularly towards the end, hopefully some of it will be new bits and pieces as well. Just if people, I'm more than happy to share the PowerPoint, so don't feel that you need to make copious amounts of notes. If people want to ask questions, obviously pop them in the chat box, and I'll leave plenty of time for people to ask questions at the end. Yeah, so as David has already mentioned, if I can get my slides to actually work, there we go. So yeah, I now am the Senior Regional Advisor at Foundations. We are, on behalf of the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, we call them DLUC. We are the national advisory body for the Disabled Facilities Grant, as well as home improvement agencies, including adaptation services. So I manage the 5 regional advisors, and basically we are here to support you in the role that you do as practitioners in the DFG process. So as I say, we've got 5 regional advisors, and I've got a slide at the end that goes through which areas we all cover. So if you've ever got a query, a question around any adaptation that you're doing, any application that you're involved in, any queries, then come to us. A lot of OTs think that they can't come to Foundations. Obviously, they wouldn't have employed me as an occupational therapist if we weren't here for you guys. So that's what we do at Foundations. We are that national advisory body on behalf of government, and we do lots of bits and pieces, which I'll cover at the end in terms of how we provide you guys with the support and the role that you're doing. So today is just talking around robust decision making. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey around actually why is our role sometimes quite challenging as occupational therapists in terms of the DFG process. And then I'm going to talk about kind of the decision making element around some of the rules behind that, and to get you to think a little bit around actually what is our principal role in the DFG process. And then obviously we'll kind of dig a little bit into actually what are the kind of things we need to consider in looking at what's necessary and appropriate. And I'm going to use the Redbridge case as an example in terms of how we ensure kind of robust decision making. I'm not necessarily going to have lots of answers for you. I think sometimes presentations like this raise more questions than the answers, but hopefully there'll be some useful things for you to take away. So why is our role as occupational therapists in the DFG so challenging? And the reason it's so challenging, and if anybody's heard me speak before, I often talk about these two hats that we wear. And it's these two hats that we wear that can make the role quite challenging, because sometimes you need to be aware that they are quite two distinct hats, although they complement each other. If you're not aware that you actually wear two hats and you just think you wear one hat, then actually that's where you're going to have kind of challenges. So I think hopefully this bit around that just helps you understand the two hats that you wear will help clarify some of the challenges that you have. So the two hats that you wear, the first hat you wear is the main reason that majority of us are sat here this afternoon, which is, and I know we've got Sherry on the line, because so Sherry's a housing occupational therapist, but the main reason that the majority of you are sat here this afternoon, I would imagine, is because of the assessment function that social care is using you for, in terms of either the Care Act, or for those of you that work for children's, under the Children's Act and the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act. So that's the main reason that the majority of you that sit within social care are employed, because what social care uses your assessment skills for is to help them discharge their duties in terms of the preventative element of the Care Act, which is around providing preventative services that support people to reduce, delay, or prevent people developing health and social care needs. And your skills are absolutely fantastic, because you work really hard. Your assessment skills are really good to help understand how that person's home environment is impacting on their health and well-being, and you can use your assessment skills to begin to identify possible solutions. Similar with Children's Act, Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, that still applies to children. Obviously, you'll gather quite quickly that children's isn't my area of expertise, but again, your assessment skills as an occupational therapist is being used within children's social care to look at how you support that child and family welfare and safeguarding. And again, your skills are absolutely fantastic in terms of understanding that. You also might have a role in terms of where somebody may have potential eligible needs under the Care Act. You might also be involved in assessing those potential eligible needs as well. So the fantastic thing about your assessment skills, whether you're working with adults or children, and whether you're looking at meeting eligible need, or whether you've got a more preventative role, is that your assessments will lead to finding solutions for that individual, and that where you're not immediately just jumping to a care package. Because often what we can do is provide a bit of advice. I must correct this. I say this every time I do this presentation, because I've missed technology off the end of assistive there. But we can look at equipment, assistive technology, and it may be that you think, actually, the issue that we've got in terms of the home environment that's preventing you from, maintaining your health and well-being, is actually it's the home environment. And what we could be doing is looking at adaptations to reduce, prevent, delay people developing health and social care needs, or to meet eligible need, and similarly in terms of welfare with children. Okay, so that's the kind of key hat you're wearing. If at that point you identify, oh, actually, I think what we could be looking at is an adaptation. I think what we could support you with is making a recommendation for a DFG application. If you take that journey with the person that you're working with, and you suggest that the person could apply for a DFG, then what you need to do is kind of take your social care hat off, because what you are then doing is you are then supporting housing in terms of the DFG. So you're supporting housing, put together the DFG application, and your assessment is supporting that application process. So as you all know, hopefully you all know, the DFG, Disabled Facilities Grant, sits in housing legislation, has nothing to do with social care. It is housing legislation, okay? And what you are doing, and I'll go through this in a bit more detail shortly, what you are doing when you have put your kind of DFG assessment hat on, what you are doing in terms of your assessment is that assessment is guiding and looking at what adaptations are necessary and appropriate in terms of relevant work, because somebody can only apply for a DFG if the works are relevant, and that's the role that you are fulfilling in terms of the DFG. What you have to be very careful of is that, and often where these two hats can kind of become an issue if you kind of forget which hat you're wearing, is the DFG is a fantastic asset. So those of you that work in adult social care, we talk about strength-based approaches. We talk about looking at what assets the person has available to them to meet their health and social care needs. One of the most fantastic assets that a person can access to meet their health and social care needs is a disabled facilities grant. But you have to be aware that in terms of the mandatory grant, there are very specific purposes for which a person can apply for a grant. Okay, there are 13 very specific purposes, which I'll show you shortly. Sometimes those purposes don't always align with what you will look at in terms of the Care Act. And actually, this is where you can get that tension. So there can be a little bit of tension between housing legislation, so what you can use the DFG for, and actually whether that is something that you can use to address a statutory duty that you're looking at in terms of social care legislation. So it's just, that's where sometimes you can get that tension. So I'm just going to use two very crude examples around the tension between housing, the DFG bits and pieces, and then the tension with what you might be looking at with under your kind of statutory duties under social care. They're very crude examples, but hopefully they kind of illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. And again, I apologise because I know I kind of talk, do these slides in lots of presentation. A very good example could be where you are working with little Mrs. Russell, who can get in and out of a property no problem, can get out into the garden, can, you know, peg out the laundry, etc. What she's struggling to do though is get to her GPs, get to the local community centre to keep connected, and so she's bought herself a scooter so that she can kind of keep kind of connected with her community, avoiding all that social isolation. Something that legitimately you will look at in terms of kind of those Care Act wellbeing principles. However, if you, so the issue for little Mrs. Russell can get in and out of the property fine, but she can't kind of go off and go shopping. So she's bought herself a scooter, and the issue is she can get in and out of the property, but what she can't do is lift the scooter in and out of the property. So she's come to you at social care because she wants a ramp. Totally understandable need in terms of what you're looking at under the Care Act. But if you're wanting to apply for a DFG, then it has to be necessary and appropriate. And yes, one of the purposes is around access in and out of the property, but Mrs. Russell can get in and out of the property. She just can't go off and do the shopping. But that's not one of the purposes for which you can use a DFG, because Mrs. Russell can get in and out it's just that she can't kind of go off to the shops, etc., etc. So that is a very crude example. Now, hopefully, you've got a discretionary grant, you've got you're using your regulatory reform order powers, and you've got housing assistance policy that gives you some flexibility for those types of cases, whereby it would reduce input from social care. But I'm just trying to show you where there's potential tensions. Another very crude example could be something like where you've got a child who needs additional space for sensory integration bits and pieces. Again, in terms of the DFG, therapeutic use adaptations isn't one of the purposes for which you can use a DFG. So you just, like I say, the DFG is a wonderful asset, but it has only got 13 purposes. And if you're not careful, because of those two hats you wear, because you're kind of looking at those kind of well-being bits and pieces about keeping socially connected, that's where you can potentially hit some issues. Because remember, what you're doing is using housing legislation to address a statutory duty under social care legislation. Now, having said that there are some natural tensions that can occur, actually, there are some really positive synergies between how you can use the DFG to meet some of those things that you will be addressing under the Care Act. And I apologise now to my children's colleagues, because this is obviously the kind of Care Act that is related to children. Have to say a huge thank you to my colleague Anita Mottram in Kirklees, who put this slide together to show you, in terms of that the DFG as an asset, how you can kind of use it as an asset to meet some of those kind of eligible needs that you might be looking at under the Care Act. So although I've kind of discussed that tension, hopefully this is a useful reminder around the kind of usefulness of the DFG. So I want to talk about necessary and appropriate this afternoon. But before I get there, I just want to look at what can I give a grant for. And again, I apologise because we do use these slides for a number of presentations, but I think these next slides are a good reminder in terms of robust decision making for a DFG. So we will get lots of calls from OTs, technical officers, caseworkers, members of the public to say, can I give a grant, or can I get a grant for? And actually, it's not about the actual adaptation itself. It all depends on whether there is it kind of falls into the rules and the decision making, which I will go through now with you. And I think this makes it really simple in terms of understanding the kind of how somebody becomes eligible or for a grant. So the basic, what you need to know is that there are 4 key elements to a robust DFD decision. There needs to be a disabled occupant, there needs to be an applicant, and the works have to be eligible. And there's also about the amount of grant. So I'm just going to quickly go through disabled occupant, the applicant, and then we'll delve a little bit deeper into eligible works, because this is your role in that application process for a DFG. So really decision, the first kind of decision that has to be ticked off is that first decision around whether we've got a disabled occupant. So 1, have you got a disabled person? Add in some kind of accommodation, and if you have, that's that kind of first decision that you kind of can tick. Again, in the new DFG guidance, it unpacks what disability, what kind of types of disability can be considered. It is quite a broad definition of around what we mean by disabled. So it's more around kind of those kind of sensory motor processing impairments caused by conditions, etc. So if you've got a disabled person, they're in accommodation, then that kind of first decision that has to be made around whether somebody is eligible for DFG is ticked because you've got a disabled occupant. The next decision that you kind of have to tick off is, do we have an applicant? So as long as we have a tenant, an owner, or an occupant, so that's an occupant of a houseboat or caravan, then yes, we have got an applicant. And just a reminder that the applicant isn't always the disabled person. So for example, if little Mrs. Russell has moved into her son or daughter's property, then the applicant in that situation, because little Mrs. Russell lives in the daughter's or son's property, the applicant in that situation is the son or the daughter that little Mrs. Russell has moved in. So the applicant isn't always the disabled person. So if you've got a tenant, an owner, or an occupant, then that's that second decision that you can tick off because you've got an applicant. Then you have to decide whether the works are eligible works. Okay. And there's a two-stage test to this. The first test is quite objective. Does it meet one or more of the 13 purposes for which, so this is the mandatory grant I'm talking about. So does it meet one or more of the 13 purposes for which you can apply for DFG? And I'm going to show you those in a minute. They're quite objective. Either they do, either it does or it doesn't. So those are quite objectives. So that's the first test. Then the second stage of that two-stage test is, are what is being recommended, the works that are required, are they necessary and appropriate? And is it reasonable and practicable to carry out those works? Okay. And it's that second stage of deciding whether the works are eligible that is much more kind of subjective. And as you know, which I'll show on a later slide, this is your involvement in the DFG process, because where you're a two-tier authority, then housing has to consult with social care as to what is necessary and appropriate. So that is your role. You work alongside housing to determine what you feel is necessary and appropriate based on that person's needs. And it's that bit that is always going to be subjective to those individual circumstances. So what you might do for Mrs. Russell at number 23 might be quite different to what you do for Mrs. Jones at 25. And it is always based on individual circumstances. So these are the 13 purposes for which you can and can't use a DFG. And I think as an occupational therapist, you are often the first person that is suggesting that somebody could look at applying for a DFG, and therefore it is critical that you know exactly the 13 purposes for which you can and can't use a DFG. Because if you don't know these off by heart, this is where you can start taking a person down a DFG application, which isn't the right kind of route for that individual to get their adaptations funded. So it's really important that you understand the 13 purposes for which you can use a DFG. So it's access to the home. Interestingly, it's about making the home safer, not only for the disabled person, but everybody living in that property. So that's often the one where you've got behaviours of concern with a sibling. You may be able to use that. Now, it's the various accesses. So access to family room, access to a bedroom, access to a toilet, access to a bath, shower, access to a wash basin. Notice that there is no access to a dining room. So again, if you are involved with children's cases, this is often one that tends to come up. Then in terms of the mandatory grant, then there is no access to dining room. It's about facilities that enable the person to prepare or cook food. So again, doesn't include necessarily storage, which I know can be an issue, but can include, if you need a specialist cooker, can potentially include those bits and pieces. It's whatever facilities the person requires to prepare and cook food. In the new guidance, for those of you that work with children, it does cover what you should do if you've got a child where, as part of their natural development, they need access to accessible facilities to enable that child to reach those milestones. Doesn't necessarily cover where you've got a disabled child and perhaps parents want them to watch. It is about providing facilities that enable that child to meet those development milestones that, if given the right facilities, they'd be able to reach. Better heating or cooling. So the cooling element is slightly new, isn't necessarily in, well, it isn't in the legislation. It just talks about better heating, but in the new guidance, it does incorporate cooling. Please remember that the legislation was written in '96, so it's nearly 30 years old. Our understanding of conditions has moved on significantly. So actually we're aware of conditions such as MS and other kind of neuromuscular conditions where perhaps excessive heating can lead to muscle fatigue, and including some sensory conditions as well. So in the new guidance, it does unpack cooling a little bit more. Control of heating, light and power, access to care for others, and access to a garden, which I always tend to brush over because it always tends to be quite a contentious issue, is access to garden and what that looks like. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Now I'm hoping, I've got an awful feeling, oh yes it does. David, has a toilet appeared on my slide?
Yes.
Lovely. Right. So I'm just going to take you through kind of the decision making around eligible works. So you might identify that somebody might need a closet mat. So what you might, the first decision is that one of the purposes for which you can use a DFG, access to a toilet, is. You then need to make that decision around whether it's necessary and appropriate. So so you think about closet mat. So why is that the most cost-effective, necessary and appropriate solution? Well, it could be the person has difficulty cleaning themselves. So raised toilet seat isn't sufficient. And a closet mat or other wash dry toilet products are available. So yes, from your clinical point of view, it's necessary and appropriate because there are no other cost-effective solution will provide access to a toilet, and therefore you can say it's necessary and appropriate. Reasonable and practicable is a very narrow definition. Basically, as long as the condition, the house is in good condition and there isn't an issue in terms of age of the property, then reasonable and practicable is very narrow. So yes, it meets the purposes. Yes, we've been able to provide that professional reasoning that's necessary and appropriate, and therefore, yes, it's eligible works. Another one might be get referrals, somebody struggling to get in and out of the bath. You might identify a wet room. So yes, a wet room is something that from a purpose point of view provides access to bath or shower. Is it necessary and appropriate? Well, we've tried bath bomb, bath seats. We could try a bath lifter, but actually we know little Mrs. Russell is aging in place. It's likely that will only provide a very short-term solution. And actually to keep her independent, to prevent the need for any extra home care, if we put a wet room in, then that will provide a really good, effective, long-term sustainable solution. So from a necessary appropriate point of view, you're able to provide that rationale. She's in a 1960s property, it's in good condition, and we've got no concerns there. So again, in terms of eligible works in that second stage test, yes, it's kind of eligible works. So we get little Mrs. Russell a referral around, she's asking for additional heating. Well, yeah, that is something that we can use a DFG for. So in terms of purposes, yes, that's something that we can use a DFG for. But actually, the reason that she's got an issue is not because there's not adequate heating, but the boiler isn't working and needs repair. So it's not about it being necessarily appropriate in terms of her disability. It's a repair issue, and that's not something we can use a DFG for. Similarly, we get referral for a young child. They're wanting to provide access to dining facilities so that they can be with their family. Again, in terms of mandatory grant, then that there is no purpose for which you can provide a DFG for dining facilities. So that kind of fails at that point, as it were. So hopefully that's a useful visualization of eligible works. But I just want to probe a little bit deeper about actually what should we be considering in terms of what is necessary and appropriate. And we're going to, and again, apologies to anybody that attended our roadshows, because I'm going to use the Redbridge case to illustrate the importance around what kind of things should we be considering and when the decision making perhaps doesn't go as well as we'd like to do. So I'm going to give a very, very quick overview of the Redbridge case. So this was a referral that came through from the applicants who wanted to apply for a stair lift as a backup to the through floor lift that had been fitted. It was for their son, who was a young gentleman with quite complex needs, who needed a through floor lift to obviously go from ground floor up to bedroom facilities. There'd been some issues previously with an old through floor lift, and then I think there may have been some issues with the new one that had been fitted. And so the OT was asked to go out and do an assessment for a backup for a stair lift to the through floor lift. So the OT went out and felt that it was appropriate, necessary and appropriate for a stair lift to be fitted. However, when that went through to housing looked at it and decided that it wasn't reasonable or practicable to carry out or to install a stair lift as a backup, and obviously turned down the application and didn't approve it. My understanding is that the applicants, the parents, then obviously went through the complaints procedure, wasn't happy with the outcome of the complaint procedure, and then took it to judicial review, to the High Court for judicial review. And when the judge looked at it, this is the part of the legislation that he looked at in terms of determining whether the decision that Redbridge took was legal. Is that the right word? Hopefully you know what I mean. So this was the part of the legislation that he looked at. So obviously in determining whether the works are relevant, have to decide whether they're necessary and appropriate and that it's reasonable and practicable to carry out the work. So he obviously looked at all the evidence that was produced, and what he said was, well, basically you're saying that it's necessary and appropriate because you've consulted with social care and you've determined and you've agreed with the OT that the works aren't necessary and appropriate, but that you've turned it down on it being reasonable and practicable. Well, if you look at the legislation, in terms of turning, declining an application around it being reasonable and practicable, the only thing that you can consider in that decision making is that the dwelling that you have to have regard to the age and condition of the dwelling and the building. And when the judge looked at the case, I can't remember how old the property was, but I think it was like kind of like a 1960s property. So actually, it was a reasonable age and in good condition, and that's what the judge said, was actually it was unlawful for you to decline the adaptation based on reasonable and practicable, because you've already told us that actually the property is of reasonable age and condition. And what the judge kind of asked the local authority to do was to go back and have a look around the necessary and appropriate element of the decision making. So in terms of refusing, I mean, hopefully you work in local authorities where the approach is always to kind of consider and try to find ways to say yes, which is one of the rulings from the Islington case. If you're going to decline an adaptation, then it is going to be around what is necessary and appropriate. And I think this is where it becomes even more important as occupational therapists that we truly understand the kind of things that we should be considering in terms of what is necessary and appropriate. The only thing I would point out is remember that ultimately the final decision around eligible works is that it's the housing authority's decision. Your role is that you are providing that consultation as part of that application as to what is necessary and appropriate. Now, in the legislation, it only talks about where the local authority, so where you're in a two-tier authority, so that's where social care sits at county, and obviously housing duties lie within at district level. In the legislation, that is the only kind of mention of consultation that there needs to be with housing and social care. So in theory, if you're in a unitary authority, then this consultation doesn't apply. But I think the reason it's not, I mean, in most unitary authority, I would say that you are still involved in some type of consultation. And I think mainly because probably when the legislators wrote the original legislation, I think there was this assumption that if you were in a unitary authority, that there would be naturally conversations that would happen across housing and social care, which I know isn't always the case. I think the other thing as well is that the way that the legislation is written as well is that people apply to housing in the first instance for a grant, but I think in 90% of local authorities that we work with, people's first access point to a DFG usually is instigated by some type of involvement from social care. And as social care, you're using the DFG application as an asset to meet health and social care needs. So that's just a little bit around unpicking the bit around consultation. But ultimately, even the necessary and appropriate element, yes, they consult with you, but the final decision sits with housing, and they can and do can challenge what you're recommending. So this is just a reminder in terms of necessary and appropriate, the final and reasonable and practicable. The decision is made by the housing authority, but in coming up with the kind of final decision about whether the works are eligible, they will take into account that assessment or consultation with the OT or whoever might have bring in some, because not always an OT is involved in the assessment, particularly if it's a very specialist area of need. But obviously there is around taking into account what the OT is recommending. And as I say, in terms of if you're a district council, the legislation is really clear. There has to be always that consultation. David, is there any questions before I move on?
Not so far. I think everybody's
nodded off.
No, I think everybody's just really, really interested. Or just explaining it incredibly well, which I think you are.
Oh, right, okay, right. Thank you. Flattery will get you everywhere, David. Right. So what are the kind of things we should be thinking about then? If there is a lot of sway and things that we need to think about in terms of necessary and appropriate, what kind of things should we be thinking about? In the guidance that was published, hopefully you've all got a copy, or at least you know where to find it on the government website. You've all read chapter 4 of the new guidance, because it very much spells out your role in the DFG process. I was involved in the DFG review back in 2018, and one of the things that I kind of contributed was recognising that there are no guidance. Prior to the new guidance, there were no guiding principles or around the kind of things that we all should consider as being important things to think about. So in the new guidance, there are these 9 guiding principles around. It's almost not only what you should think about, but also the approach that you should take around the kind of DFG and what is necessary and appropriate. So it's about, and as an OT, so this is based on some work by Frances Haywood. For those of you not familiar with Frances, she's now retired, but she was a researcher that did a heck of a lot of work and research around the DFG in the early 2000s. And what she did was she went back and had a look at all the adaptations that had gone wrong and identified what was missing from the approach to the assessment. And if these things had been considered, may have prevented the adaptations not working for the individual and their family. So this is based on Frances Haywood's work. And for me as an OT, it really resonates, because it is about kind of things that, in terms of the values that we have as occupational therapists, really will resonate. So it's about need to retain dignity, need to have values recognised, need for relief from pain and discomfort and danger, minimising barriers to independence, that need for element of choice, good communication, need for light, thinking about the child and their growing needs and that need for space and need of other family members and family as a whole. So we've got that in the guidance. But I think what the Redbridge case has demonstrated is that is perhaps not as, it is a really good starting point, but I think there's also a recognition that there might be other elements that are missing that we still need to consider. Right, so I do have to apologise. That is a slide that did the noise come through, David, then? Did you get the alert come through?
No, I didn't.
Oh, right, okay, it's all right, I got the alert.
We have got a question.
All right, go on, yes, let's answer the question.
This has come from Maggie McWilliams Harrison. She asks, can I access DFG? Can I access if DFG would consider a disabled person requesting removal of their level access shower, preferring a bath installed instead? Right,
so you can, so providing bathing facilities is one of the purposes of the DFG. You then need to provide a rationale as to why that is necessary and appropriate. So if they can access their shower, but they are wanting bathing about relaxation, pain relief, then again, that's where you're going beyond what you can potentially use a DFG for. So because then you're getting into the realms of medical need to bathe, as opposed to that without a bath, she can't access anything. So you need to be able to argue why, by providing a bath, that's the only way the person can access, because remember, the DFG isn't around pain relief, etc. So I know that I don't know if that's helpful, but I know this is often we get quite a number of calls around bathing, and particularly when people have moved into a property with a wet room and their preference. So I don't like to get into the debates around wants and needs. I think that's very emotive. It's very subjective. It's about saying, based on the purposes for which you can use a DFG, why is that the most necessary and appropriate way to provide access to bathing or showering facilities? So I don't know if that's helped answer that question.
Maggie says that's helpful. It is sometimes to do with pain relief and sometimes around personal choice.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it's fully appreciate, but it's about providing a grant that is providing access to, and I think, yeah, it's about why it's necessary and appropriate, and I'll unpick this a little bit more. So we're doing some work going forward at Foundations just to unpack a little bit more about what we mean about what other factors that we should be looking at in terms of necessary and appropriate. And I just want to give you some more things to think about this afternoon. So to drive this work forward, and again, apologies for those that came to the roadshow because we kind of introduced this piece of work, but we're using, you'll be glad to hear, the PEO model to help structure our thinking. So in terms of the person, we're looking at body functions, roles, routine, values, and beliefs. In terms of environment, we're thinking about the physical environment, economic environment, and social and cultural environment. And then in terms of what's necessary and appropriate, we're thinking about what we need to do, what we have to do, what we want to do. We've then started to kind of use the 9 principles that Francis Haywood came up with to begin to unpack this and provide a much more kind of detailed criteria around what we should be considering. Now, I've done a lot of reflecting over the last couple of months since we've had the road shows back in I think they were back in March. For me, I think the bit that is missing from an OT perspective, I think we do, to be honest, I think we do all these bits and pieces really, really well. I think the bit that we struggle with is around the economic element of it and how we also manage those conversations. And let me just take you through the next slides so that you understand what I mean. I think the other important thing, and I've not put it in the slide, but I think with the complex cases, in the new guidance, there is a lovely diagram that shows a collaborative approach to decision making around necessary and appropriate, reasonable and practicable, which is, I know that's not very good, I don't know if you can see, but there's on page 38 of the guidance, there is an integrated approach to assessment around necessary and appropriate. And what I would say with complex cases, in the guidance, it says right from the get-go that the decision making isn't just sat in social care, that actually it's joint decision making, and that's where you should be doing those joint visit with housing colleagues, because some of the bits and pieces that we need to do, we can't do. We're not builders at the end of the day. We do pick up a lot of knowledge around what is potentially possible, but I think with those complex cases, we need to work with housing, because ultimately it's housing's grant, and so they need to make sure that they're involved in that decision making right from the get-go, rather than it being yourselves that are going in, perhaps unintentionally raising expectations of what can and can't be provided through the DFG. And I think it's the economic bit that I think perhaps we need to do more work, and certainly Foundations, one of the things I want to kind of look at is how we support OTs to do this element much better. So it's about because it has to be the most cost-effective solution, and it has to be value for money, and how we do that in a structured way. So this is the piece of work that we're looking at. For me, I think we do actually do this reasonably well. I think sometimes the cases like Redbridge, actually, perhaps when you look at some of the decision making, if there was a better understanding around necessary and appropriate, the kind of things that you should be considering, you do wonder if the decision was the right one. But obviously it's very easy to say that when we weren't involved in the assessment. So I think we have to be very cautious about making any assumptions about the original assessment. But for me, I think this is the bit that we need much more kind of knowledge on, because we don't get taught this bit. I think the other bits and pieces we get taught a lot around. I think the other bit that we might need to do a bit more work around is ensuring that we've looked at the alternative non-adaptations, and ensuring that we've gone and exhausted that route before we look at adaptations. So perhaps that's the other area that we could do with highlighting and doing a little bit more around. But that just gives you a sense of how we should be unpacking necessary and appropriate, and the kind of things that we need to be considering. I just want to kind of talk a little bit, because I do get a lot of queries and questions from housing teams who do question the recommendations that we make as practitioners. And one of the things that I get feedback from occupational therapists is that we have to be person-centered, that we are advocates for our clients, and the importance of recognising people's preferences. I get our code of conduct quoted at me a lot in terms of my assessment. I have to be holistic, I have to take into account. So I just want to kind of give you a different perspective, because also in your code of your professional standards is around resources and sustainability and your responsibilities within that. And I think certainly in terms of obviously what I've mentioned in this last slide, in terms of kind of cost to meet needs and making sure it's value for money, sometimes that makes us feel uncomfortable because it can make us feel like we're gatekeepers to resources. So I just want to give you a different perspective in terms of useful information and helpful kind of bits that are in our professional code of practice that should be shaping our professional reasoning when we're looking at advising our housing colleagues around what's necessary and appropriate. So I just want to point out, so this is taken from, as I say, professional standards for occupational therapists and conduct and ethics. So this is the statement that is taken from section 4 and specifically the subsections under 4.10. So it's about that we've all got a responsibility to effectively and efficiently manage the resources that include kind of the financial resources as well. And for me, what's really important is, and certainly having managed an occupational therapy team and services, is that this means using resources to deliver services in a way that does not compromise the health of present or future generations. And for me, that's a significant statement there. You have to remember that your local authority gets a fixed amount for their DFG allocation each year. And you can actually find, if you want to know what your local authority gets, you can have a look at that on our DFG, on our foundation's website. So your local authority has a very fixed, finite amount of money that it gets from the Department of Levelling Up that now sits within the Better Care Fund in your area. And your housing team has a statutory duty to provide mandatory grants. So it's really important as part of your decision making that you are mindful that in terms of this DFG, it is a finite pot of money. And it's about ensuring that our professional reasoning takes into account kind of the sustainability of that DFG resource. What's really useful under that section 4.10 is you seek to ensure that your services meets the needs of those who access it now and in the future. So again, it's not just about thinking about those individuals that we're going and knocking and seeing and visiting now, but obviously as a manager or as a practitioner, we need to be mindful of those other individuals who will need to access the services and things like the DFG in the future. We have to consider as part of our professional reasoning, and again, this is taken directly from one of the subsection in 4.10, is that you seek to gain and provide value for money. So again, as part of that conversation that you should be having with individuals and families where you're looking at making recommendations, is about saying, I've got a duty of care in terms of my recommendations, that we always look at the most cost-effective solution. And that is going to be part of my decision making in terms of what I'm going to be recommending as necessary and appropriate. So where service resources are limited, any priorities that are identified and choices made are compliant with legal requirements and national and or local policies. So again, the legislation will support you. The DFG guidance supports you, because again, in terms of the DFG guidance, it talks about the most cost-effective solution will be funded. If people want a preferred scheme, fantastic. You can look and support how they can perhaps top up if they want a more enhanced scheme. That isn't an issue. And obviously you can work with that individual to look at how they might be able to access additional funding for something that is more than you can recommend as being necessary and appropriate. But your guidance will back you up. You will have a housing assistance policy and local policies that make it very clear as part of that decision making and professional decision making that you look at, use that those resources in terms of supporting your decision making. The other thing that I found really useful is in establishing priorities and providing services, the choice of those who access the service are taken into account. So that obviously that's not only the individuals that we're working with, but I think so I know we've got a few managers on the call today. So I think, again, where you are involved in, and where you're fortunate enough to be involved in developing local policies, it's about working with those groups of people who access the services, to work with them around that co-production and saying, we want to have a fair and equitable policy. We want everybody, all residents within the local authority and get as much value out of the DFG as possible, but we need to be fair. So can we work with you? We've got this issue. Can we work with you to look at a fair way in which we can develop our policies and procedures to support you? So again, it's working. Often there can be issues around how we interpret access to a garden. And again, it's about working with parent groups, because often issues can arise or tensions can arise where looking at, what does safe access mean? Could that include, etc., etc. And I think it's about working with communities to co-produce policies and procedures that really support everybody, so that they share that responsibility that DFG is a great asset, and we need to ensure that all residents have just as equal access to it and benefit from it, and working with those groups to ensure that we do that. And again, it's very easy for me to say that. So I think I just wanted to highlight that, because I think for me, again, I often get the back at me, oh, we've got a duty to be person-centered, etc., etc. Being person-centered is to be really effective and to be really person-centered. It's those conversations to help the person understand the opportunities, but also the constraints for what we've got around the DFG and how that will shape what we can design in terms of the adaptation. And again, I think this is just a useful reminder in terms of our professional standards, a reminder of the other bits that in terms of the use of resources. So hopefully that will give you some reassurance around some of those tricky conversations that we have to have at times, and I'll come on to that shortly.
We have a question.
Go on, David.
It's come from Deirdre. So she says, I presume this little case, McCowan, does this fit in with resources?
McEwen, yeah.
So that was the Islington case. Yeah, what was the question?
It's just that I was the OT, the independent OT that was asked by the law firm to go in initially to say, is this possible to put this in? And the decision, I mean, it was possible, but I didn't think it was necessary and appropriate or the most reasonable and practicable. But what they did is they then took it to judicial review, and the judge more or less said that that the grant, she'd had various grants, and the grant just could be added on, and he actually said it could still be used, and I think the lift was put in. But that seemed to me that the resources side of things didn't get considered there.
So Deirdre, I feel really sorry for you, because the Islington case gets, I bet your heart must sink every time they mention that case. So I think, remember, case law has to be done, because without case law, everybody just interprets. And I think, so I think, well done for dealing with such a difficult case. The Islington one is interesting. What the kind of, my interpretation is, what the judge was basically saying was, you should look at each individual purpose in its own merits. So basically, yes, technically it was possible for was it an external step lift that could be done?
Yeah.
It's an interesting one, because our director Paul feels that Islington challenged it, should have gone back and challenged it, because basically, yes, it was fine saying it was eligible for a DFG, but actually they were also the landlord, and what the landlord should have actually said was, yes, we can see that in terms of the DFG and the legislation, they're eligible for a DFG, but as a landlord, we're not going to approve this because we don't think it's best use of our stock. So for us, we think that sadly, because Islington didn't go back and challenge it, which is kind of what you were saying to Islington, look, yes, it can be done, but actually, given the nature of the stock, given the nature of the potential issues, it's probably, so that's where we feel that Islington, we missed a little bit of an opportunity with that case. I'm really pleased to meet you, Deirdre, because I've wondered for years who the poor OT was involved in that case. But again, you can see how. And again, I think what I think the Redbridge case will be, I don't know who the OT is, and I think, it's easy for us to sit back and judge, but I think it's important that we don't, because we don't know the ins and outs of it, and it's not for us to do that. It's obviously, that's why we have case law. But I think that's where that robustness in decision making, but I don't think anybody would necessarily disagree with your rationale as to why you didn't think it was the best use of. I think with just the Islington, obviously in terms of you need to, what the difference Islington made was that you have to look at each individual purpose in its own merits before saying no. I think in a way it's been of benefit, because what it does challenge is blanket policy making. So you get situations where some local authorities won't put wet rooms into first floor flats, where actually you kind of think, well, this person, is only doing the external steps once or twice a week, which they can manage fine. Actually, they've got visual problems, they've got balance problem, which is, do you know what I mean, where you can. So I think the Islington has been good because it kind of challenges those decisions. But yeah, I think the way that your rationale in terms of advising Islington on the best use of their housing stock was the right one, but obviously they should have said no as the landlord, but yes as the grant provider. Did that make any sense, Deirdre?
Yes,
I'd love to,
because I was surprised. So
I think your rationale was the right rationale for them as the landlord, and it's just a real shame that that as the landlord they didn't go back and kind of say, yes, as the grant approvers will approve it, but actually as the landlord we don't think this is best use of our stock, which is basically what you were saying. So lovely to meet you, Deirdre, and
Thank you.
And I think it's really good in terms of for independent OTs as well. I think obviously, Deirdre, you've probably worked in local authorities for years and years before you did independent work.
Yeah.
But I do have concerns where new people coming into independent practice, that is fine, but you really have to understand the nuances of the legislation. Otherwise, you may not be giving sound advice. And we have just done some guidance for independent practitioners. Sorry, I'm just mindful of time because I've been talking for over an hour. And again, again, this is from the our code of professional standards. We can't always meet people's first choices, and actually we've got a duty to explain and look at alternatives where they're available. And I think, again, I think this is a bit of a gap in terms of our training of OTs in this area. I don't know how well we equip ourselves as occupational therapists to have those conversations, because they're quite complex conversations to have. You're having to have a real good understanding of legislation. You have to be a good mediator. You have to help the person understand the nuances of the legislation, and you need time to do that. And I don't know whether our training that we give people coming in to this field of practice, I do think at times there's a kind of gap in our kind of training. The other thing
sorry, Rich, we've got another question along that lines. HSmart1 asks, when a service user chooses something different in the design of the adaptation and is willing to pay for this, but the OT believes or feels it would not be safe or appropriate, where does the OT stand?
Right, so the OT stands, remember, it's a housing grant. You are there to provide guidance around what's necessary and appropriate. It's housing's decision as to whether they're comfortable with providing the grant that goes against what you're kind of recommending. Obviously, it depends on the nature of what the risk is, etc., etc. But housing can approve a grant if they're happy to support the person making the application, but you have to document the risks and make those very, very clear. So it's not about you changing what you're recommending, and ultimately the final decision sits with housing. If they go against what you recommend and you've documented the risks, etc., etc., then it's about you managing that.
HSmart commented that they work in the housing team.
Sorry, say that again.
They commented that they work in the housing team.
So is it so I mean, at the end of the day, if housing are going with your recommendations that you don't feel the works are relevant because of the risk associated with it, then it's about you documenting that, and I guess housing would probably go with you in terms of what you're suggesting. If the applicant wants to challenge your rationale, then that's an interesting. I spoke to a practitioner this morning. I think sometimes we feel uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, you've got your code of ethics. If you're not comfortable, you've done that risk assessment. You don't think it's reasonable risk, etc., etc. Because it all depends what the risk is at the end of the day. Sorry, David, I'm just feeling I'm waffling.
No, I think you are right, Rachel. It's a really difficult one to try and balance. I mean, as you rightly say, it's the housing authority make the final decision. Even as an OT, I've worked in a housing team myself, and we're still only providing that consultation to the housing team.
Yes.
And what the housing authority do with that information is entirely up to them. Whether they approve something, whether they don't, they have to be confident, or they have to be sure that it's that they're taking an acceptable risk to them.
Yes, yeah, and that's for them to make. And I think it's about just making making sure that the applicant and the disabled person is aware of what your concerns are, etc., etc. Yeah, sorry if I've waffled that, but hopefully it's
I think
been
that it comes down to any type of intervention you work with anybody is explaining what the potential risks are, what the benefits are,
Yeah.
why you agree with it, why you may not agree with it, and
Yeah.
laying that out to the individual. As everybody, you know, we have to assume that everybody has a capacity to make an unwise decision, and people
Yeah.
sometimes have to live with the consequences of their decision. I know that might be an unpopular opinion.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got another question.
I think the difficulty is it's always hard to, unless you've got it's easier to deal with very specific cases because you've got something tangible to be able to provide that professional reasoning, because you can look at, right, well, if we don't do anything, what would the consequences be? Do you know what I mean? It's all that, and it's really hard to give and that's why as regional advisors at foundations, if you have got those cases, give us a call. We can act as that critical kind of friend to help you work through some of that professional reasoning. The other thing that I often have conversations around, which can cause us some tension, is our role. Are we an advocate? I'm not always sure whether that is always a useful way of looking at our role in terms of the DFG process, because we're providing information that goes on an application. I've taken this, so in New Zealand, so I worked in New Zealand for 3.5 years, nearly 20 years ago now, but they've got a very different way of providing adaptations, but they have competencies. For anybody that's worked there, you'll know there's competencies that you have to achieve to be able to prescribe equipment and adaptations. And I've taken this is from their complex housing competencies, and I really love this because I actually think this better describes our role in the DFG process. So in New Zealand, one of the competencies that you have to demonstrate is that you're able to broker with the person, family, whānau, NASC, which is one of the funding bodies, or other agencies, to identify all options, including alternatives. So I really like this because I think advocate, I'm not always sure that I'm the right person to advocate if I'm supporting a DFG application, because I've got a specific role which is around identifying necessary and appropriate. But I do think I am, in the role that I've been in terms of DFG, I think I am that person that kind of brokers between the person, the family, the care agency, social care, housing, continuing healthcare funding. For me, that is my role, is around being that broker, providing that person and their family with all the information that they need to kind of, so I really like that. And we're doing some work at the moment to kind of look at competencies. The other, sorry, this is probably really small, but the other question we get around necessary and appropriate is how much information should we provide? So I get phone calls from occupational therapists that say I've been asked to provide too much information, and then we get phone calls from housing colleagues saying the OTs aren't providing sufficient information. So just in terms of necessary and appropriate, I think what you've got to remember is that the information you are providing is supporting an application for a DFG. And remember that you are using the DFG as an asset to meet health and social care needs. So if you want to kind of access the funding, I think it's just important to remember that you are providing information that goes on the grant application. And housing needs sufficient detail to be able to look at your what you're recommending and be able to say why is it necessary and appropriate and what is necessary and appropriate. So I agree they don't need the ins and outs of the person's condition, etc., but they need sufficient information that helps them understand why what you're recommending is necessary and appropriate, and what you're recommending is necessary and appropriate. So they need sufficient detail that underpins that. Just saying, I've identified it's a wet room and don't question my professional reasoning, I think is not appropriate, because you are supporting a grant application, and that grant application needs sufficient information for housing to determine whether the works are necessary and appropriate. So just for something to think about in terms of what is sufficient detail. And again, at Foundations, we're doing some work around developing a kind of a pro forma with kind of the minimum details that need to be included. So that's just a repeat of the last slide. So what kind of information should you be providing? I would say what's always really helpful is to provide which of the purposes you're applying or the person's applying for a DFG. So think about and use the terminology in those 13 purposes. I think it's always helpful to explain and explore what other options you've considered, including those non-adaptations. I think it's useful to look at what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve from having a DFG, and within that, look at what the cost benefits are. So if we don't do something, what would be the cost disadvantages to the system? So what are the cost benefits of doing the adaptations? I think, again, in terms of what you're recommending, lots of places use pro formas. So when it's simple adaptations, pro formas, but I think where it's something more complex, I think it's about not being too descriptive, and it's about really explaining what space is required for that activity that you're trying to address. What does the spatial layout need to look like? So where do the fixtures and fittings need to go? Where do things need to be positioned to support that person's independence? And then if you need particular features within fixtures and fittings, so if you need a toilet at a certain height, then that's the kind of information that you're needing to provide. If you need a certain type of bath that does a certain type of thing, it's about explaining what features the fixtures and fittings may be required. So as I say, we're doing some work around coming up with a more detailed performer. Just to say that we had the DFG assessment summit, and I know some of you on the call here took part in that. And I just wanted to kind of make you aware, those that weren't there, is that the assessment summit is around doing things differently so that we can focus even more on the complex ones, and we find alternative ways of dealing with the more simple cases. And I just wanted to share the slide because this kind of links in to what we've looked at this afternoon in terms of necessary and appropriate, and just kind of what we will be doing going forward. What was really evident from the DFG summit is trust. If we're going to do things differently, so if we're going to do less simple cases and hand that over to housing colleagues or trusted assessors, then it's about building that trust up so that we feel comfortable to do things differently. I think what's really clear is that certainly kind of the stuff that we've talked about this afternoon, that if we're going to look at OTs doing things differently, so perhaps not holding on to cases for as long, that others do elements of reviewing adaptations. If we're not going to handhold the simpler adaptations, actually what we need to do from a Foundations perspective is work with key stakeholders such as yourselves to make you feel protected. So if you do make a decision, that you feel protected from a HCPC perspective. And I know we're looking at doing some work with David and the specialist section around what are your legal responsibilities, how do we support that. I think it's about taking a proportionate response. I think what we need to do at Foundations is develop much clearer competencies around the skills and knowledge. And we did start this, myself and Marnie Walker, who fantastic housing OT that worked with Housing Lynn and myself on adaptations without delay. We did start unpacking some of this, but I think we need some clearer skills and knowledge-based competencies, such as they've got in New Zealand. And again, that will help us take that much more proportionate response, as well as guiding some of the training. If you think anybody could walk in and make a recommendation for a DFG, actually, you know, this is about ensuring that quality. We, manufacturers and suppliers, are taking more and more leading role in some of the DFG assessments or recommendations. So again, we want to do some work at foundations that help us, if manufacturers and suppliers are going to get more involved, that we ensure that they're demonstrating ethical practice. So we want to do some work around that. I think there's lots of gaps. There's loads of really good training that is out there. So in terms of really good trusted assessor training out there, some really good training around how you design bathrooms, bits and pieces. So some really, but I still think there's still some gaps in terms of training. So for example, what I talked about in terms of how do you have conversations around, managing expectations, those kind of things. So we want to look at doing that at foundations and developing training that supports practitioners that are coming into this area to develop those skills and knowledge so that they feel comfortable and competent. Collaboration. It works really well across housing and health and social care when we've got really good collaboration. And I think for us at foundations, obviously I'm part of foundations that I come from a social care background. The rest of my colleagues are from housing. And I think what we learn is there's a lot we can do at foundations that help local authorities where perhaps we could be doing that collaboration better, and that we can help with that change process. And that's why we designed the OTs are from Venus, technical officers are from Mars workshops that helps explore those cultural differences between housing and social care, and helps kind of find a middle ground for how we collaborate better. And the other piece of work that we want to do is develop some better pathways to consultation that's based on complexity, that kind of makes it much clearer. And again, we did start some of this within both the DFG guidance and adaptations without delay, but I think there's some work that we can do to strengthen those pathways. So we detach assessment, as we know it as therapists, from a evaluation of the home environment that looks at what's causing disruption to health and well-being through barriers, and detach that from that kind of therapeutic assessment that we use. And I think it doesn't help that we still work in silos of practice in England and the UK, where we've got health OTs, we've got social care OTs, we've got housing OTs. I think there is a need for specialism, but I think the pathways to consultation could be a lot smoother. So that's just some work that we're doing off the back of that assessment summit. And it does link into this work because it is all around the role that we have as OTs looking at necessary and appropriate. So this is the team. So these are your regional advisors. So if you're in East Midlands, East of England, you've got our newest member of the team, Mark Pearce, who used to run a HIA in the West Midlands. Really lots of skills he brings. Those of you in London and the South East, you've currently got Dave Eldridge, but Dave Eldridge, he doesn't like me to mention the retirement word. He likes to call it moving on. So Dave is looking to move on, and he has reduced his hours, but he's your regional advisor for those of you working in London South East. If you're in North West and Cumbria, your regional advisor is Roy McNally. You can probably tell by my accent that I cover, because apparently I've got a slight Yorkshire accent. I cover Yorkshire, Humberside and the North East. And then Tim, again, he's a fairly new member of the team, and he covers the South West and West Midlands area. So if you go to our lovely website, if you go to About Us and you scroll down, you'll see these lovely pictures, and then you can click on and you can book a meeting in, you can give us a phone call. Any issues you've got around the DFG, give us a ring. We're here to help. It's free of charge, unless we're doing consultancy. But if you need us to, if you want one-off advice, you want us to come and do a service improvement workshop, if you're a practitioner, if you're a manager, I know we've got a few managers on the call this afternoon, we're here to support. We do our network meetings quarterly for OTs. We had the last one last week. We do a monthly national webinar. The ones coming up are to do with the additional £102 million that the government has given to the DFG. So we're doing that with the Department of Health and Social Care, because they're quite keen that that is used in a different way. We do lots of free online training. So we do a very comprehensive DFG basics course. And then we've got a course specifically around what you need to know as an OT, where I get to waffle at you even longer than I have done this afternoon. Oops, sorry. If you're not already a member, DFG Champions Facebook page, it's closed community, so it's only for people involved in DFG, so it's not open to members of the public, so it's a safe space. Really good place. If you've ever got a query, a question, pop it on there. You can post anonymously if you don't want to give your name over, but it is we've got over 2,000 members. It is a really active Facebook page. Always a good one if you've got a question. If you do a search and use the kind of key terms that you're looking at, it will usually bring up various threads, because I can guarantee somebody's asked it. And as I say, we'll do service improvement workshops, and we've got our website that we are really investing in, so lots of useful resources, and it's all free. And I'm really sorry because I've gone over and a lot longer than I thought I would do. Is there any additional questions? Have I made sense? Yeah, have I made sense, David? Have I made sense? Have I made sense?
Yes, perfect sense. Melanie asks, can we access advice if we're based in Wales?
Well, you haven't got a regional advisor. That's the only thing. Our version, you've got Care and Repair Cymru. Sorry for my Welsh pronunciation there. So obviously they're our equivalent in Wales. Obviously, if it's a very so really that is the kind of line I should give you.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
a fair point. Has anybody else got any questions they want to ask while we've got Rachel?
I do apologise because there's loads of people that are here this afternoon. So I know like Di Brown, I know there was Neil, I know there's Sherry, I know there's quite a lot of people that this might have felt a bit of a repetition because just because of the bits and pieces, I can't kind of mesh various presentations together. But like I say, hopefully it's still relevant stuff. Just to let you all know as well, currently we're working on best practice principles for behaviours of concern. So that's a piece of work that we're doing with Safe Spaces, who've generously given us some funding to engage with a clinical psychologist. And we hope to have the first iteration of those best practice principles. And I've got Sidra, who's a first year student from Huddersfield, who, bless her, is on a 4-week placement with her, who's doing a sterling job doing a remote placement with me. And she's just kind of helping me at the moment bring all that together. So yeah, just watch out for those bits and pieces. We have got the road shows coming up in September as well. So we've got 5 dates. Unfortunately, most of them are sold out, but you can go on the wait list, and usually tickets are released nearer the time. And the 3 areas that we'll be covering is launching the behaviour. We'll be doing a whole bit around behaviours of concern. We're doing a whole bit around using DFG to support more minor adaptations and handy person bits. And the other bit that will be of interest is how we deal with expensive, or not expensive, but complex, costly adaptations, and how do we look at that joint working. So I might be contacting some of you. Neil, I don't know if Neil's still on the call, but I'll be contacting Neil. Yeah, I'll be contacting you to see, because I know you do some good work around collaboration and decision making. Sorry, Neil, I'll be coming towards you. So we're covering actually how do we do that, because at the end of the day, DFG is fantastic, but it can't do everything. So how do we bring health, social care to that table? And I think importantly, it's you guys that get caught up in the middle of that decision making. You're the ones that get caught up in that decision making, and you end up holding cases because nobody will make a decision as to where the additional funding's from. So that's the other bit we'll be covering on the roadshow.
Maggie's put a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Would DFG consider space for a disabled parent for additional bedroom, bathroom and space to work from home?
Right. So in terms of the mandatory grant, it's about possibly, you'd have to fit it into one of those 13 purposes. However, we are aware that some local authorities have in their housing assistance policies, because of COVID, around providing discretionary grants to enable people to work from home. So again, the answer is you have to demonstrate which one or more of the purposes you'll want if you're looking at mandatory grant, and then you need to say why it's necessary and appropriate. But I would imagine with that kind of case, like I say, there's, I can't remember which local authority, but I know there is one local authority that has got a discretionary grant for those types of cases.
I think that's it. There was one question about, is there a core list of costs? But I think that would depend on where you are in the country.
Yeah, the other thing as well is, remember, you're the, and again, some of you might, I know some of the housing OTs might roll their eyes at me, but remember, for your social care OTs, I think where you're getting involved in costs, I think that's where you're needing to be kind of really collaborating with your housing team, because your role is around, your expertise is understanding how the built aspects of the home environment is impacting on independence, and potential, when housing is coming up with potential solutions, being able to identify whether they're appropriate, necessary, etc. So I think where you get involved in costs, it's just why you're getting involved with the cost element, and are you working along, that's the kind of case I would say you needing to be getting involved with housing, although I know I've kind of gone on about cost, but I think that's where you need to be collaborating, because it sounds like that's where it's getting a bit more complex. Zoe, I can see you put your hand up.
Yeah, just because, so I asked the question, I realised it was difficult to phrase properly.
Yeah, no, it's not easy online, is it?
I hope I understood what you were saying, and I suppose it's just using, I thought it was such an excellent point that you raised earlier about, for example, by using the DFG, will you be saving potentially, I don't know, care costs?
Right, okay, yeah. Yes.
It's very difficult without, you know, I can speak always very generically that, of course, by doing X and Y, Z, I'll be saving this potentially, but it feels like, unless I had sort of, but I appreciate costs are changing all the time, but in that was the context of the question.
So there is, and Neil might be able to help me answer that, there is a list of costs associated with things like residential care, bed days, etc., etc. And I know the College of OT in there, they used to have the Saving Money, Saving Lives or something or other campaign, used to have that as their model. So Neil, I know you've taken yourself off mute. Do you know what I'm referring to?
No, which is not very helpful, is it?
No, not really, Neil. Thank you. There is a recognised tool with the costings of things like care costs, etc. So let me do some homework, and when I send David the email with this link, I will have hopefully found what I'm talking about and send that through to you. Is that all right?
Despite my lack of knowledge, I am very interested in that. Could you copy me in as well?
Yes, what I'll do is I'll send it to David in the email that hopefully he'll just do a forward to all that have attended here this afternoon, and it'll have it in there. And again,
yeah, and we can do that.
Probably some training that we can possibly offer at foundations around doing that economic evaluation around, you know, bed days, what it costs for residential care. Cerebra, for anybody who works with children, Cerebra did a really good report a few years ago around the cost benefits of costly adaptations to the system. So I can put that report in as well. Link cost for care. And is that all right?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Is that all right? Can we go now? It's probably everybody's had enough, I would imagine.
So thank you very much, everybody, and
So,
a big thank you to Rachel. And this will be made available to members to watch back again.
Thank you very much.
and can I just say a huge thank you for Deirdre, because I know that's been quite a vulnerable thing that you have told us this afternoon, but I think, yeah, just a huge thank you. And it's really, I honestly mean it, it is wonderful to meet you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right.
My pleasure. Take
Bye.
care.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.